Beautiful. Okay. All right. I guess we'll start with, for like a proper interview, we'll start with, I guess, names, like introductions. So I am Colleen, and I'm trying to get this thing called the Coley Project going, which is about people dealing with the loss of a sibling.
Marya Hornbacher. I'm an author and a journalist, and I am helping Colleen with the Coley Project, at least to the best of my ability.
Okay, so I know you had mentioned at one point you lost someone who was like a sibling, or at least I feel like that's also the person I've referenced in one of your books. You had referenced having a loss like that. So I guess what I'm kind of asking people about is like, to kind of describe like the relationship they had with the person, as far as like what kind of sibling dynamic it was, and then kind of, I don't know, what that loss was like, and if you want to talk about how they died too, to your comfort level.
Yeah. Well, we killed him. So like in the end, not strictly speaking, but like my cousin Brian and I were raised together. We were, I don't know, not quite a year apart in age. Brian, like all of the kids in my family, except for me, was adopted. My brothers are adopted. My cousins are adopted. I was the surprise pink baby. And so like, here I am. And Brian and I, my earliest memory really of Brian was, we were 5 and 4 probably. And we had locked ourselves in the bathroom at grandma's house because all of the uncles were drunk, as the uncles in my family generally are. And so they were all drunk, and it had gotten very, very loud, and it was too loud for us to deal with. And so we had hustled off into the bathroom and locked ourselves in it and would not come out, would not be persuaded, only bathroom in the house. So I guess the uncles are all out peeing in the bushes. And we decided in there that we were going to, 1, escape the horrible family, and 2, get married. Because when you're 4 and 5, like that's the best way to be, like that's your only understanding, or at least it was in the 70s, right, of how to tell someone you loved them the most. You know what I mean? Yeah. And so we're very close in age. We were both very strange children. I mean, like that's the fact of it. I don't mean to be like terminally unique strange, but we were weird little kids. And I was weird for one kind of reason, and Brian was weird for another kind of reason. But in our family, which was and is, those who are still living, very, very loud and very, very, and in many ways violent. Brian and I were both bookish, nerdy little critters who did not want to argue anymore. And so we often departed the premises without leave, and were often lost and found together somewhere other than the house that we were supposed to be in. So, we were just I think we were hatched at the same rough time and wound up in a family that didn't suit us as well as we suited each other. Brian had muscular dystrophy. And so we were told that he would probably live to be 16. He actually lived to be 25. He died when I was 24. And he was 25, and we grew up together. I mean, we were just, the family was just always together. He was always there. I was always there. And when I went through a lot of struggles in my adolescence, he was the only really, I think he was the family member who was patient with me. Not that I would necessarily say I wanted cuddled, but he was patient with me. He had compassion for me, which a lot of the family members did not. And then when my first book came in the mail, the first copy of my first book came in the mail when I was 23 and he was 24. It was a few months before he died, and we had both just turned 24 and 25. So a few months before he died, the first copy came in the mail, and I called him. He lived down the street because he was in a wheelchair by then. And so I lived in the city he lived in so that he could get to me quickly through the Skyway in Minnesota. He could go all the way through the Skyway in his wheelchair, and I could get to him quickly. And we were kind of like Ann Sexton and Maxine Cumin. It was like we had our own phone bat line. You know what I mean? We had our own bat phone. Anyway, I called him and I said, the book is here. I want you to come over and look at it. And he came over and looked at it. The next day, I got roses. Roses were delivered with a tiny little card that said, finally, silence to those who doubted you. With love, your proud cousin who never did. And to this day, he is the only motherfucker who didn't doubt me. and he died. Fuck him. Anyway, so yeah, like I've never gotten over how pissed I am at him about that, man. Like I never have. And my dad asked me the other day, he's like, do you think the reason that you don't partner or really love anyone is because you lost Brian? I said, I love people, but yes, I do. I think that is why. I think I got one perfect, unconditional love in this lifetime, and it was him. Yeah, that's why.
Okay. Yeah. No. So I guess, do you, I don't know, because I always feel like that, like, first year, sometimes two, right after you lose someone can be just a haze, just like complete, you know, but do you kind of remember what the like initial feelings were, initial reaction, you know, kind of initial coping was?
Yes, he was very funny, and I am funny in my own grim way. And so I was angry, drunk, and funny the whole year, I think. Definitely drunk the whole year. Definitely angry. And I wrote, the only time I've ever written about him, I've written about a lot of things in my life, right? I've never really written about Brian. I wrote one poem not long after he died. And I don't remember what it said, except it was full of jokes and anger. You know, like it was grim. He also, so that first year, the first thing, you know, the day he died, of course, it was morning, which is the worst. I don't know when your siblings died, but but he died in the morning. And I'm like, it's daylight. Like, why do we have to do a whole day like this shit? I can't get drunk at 9 a.m. And so obviously I've since gotten sober. And so, but at the time I'm like, we're busting out the Dutch gin, forget it. Like, and so he was dead. And my husband at the time and my other best friend, Chris, Brian, Chris, and I were like the little triptych of people. So Chris and Julian, my husband at the time, and I went back to the apartment and started drinking. And I think we drank till his funeral, which was weeks later, or it seemed to me that we did. You know, that can't actually have been true. But the first year I don't think I understood this at the time. I was just insane with grief, like insane. I had to go to England. I was on book tour. It was in the middle of a book tour. I couldn't find anything in England like myself or my hotel or BBC where I had to go give interviews. My agent had to come get me in England. I remember her finding me on a side street. Like, so it's the haze of which you speak. Part of it was gin. Part of it was grief, though. Like, you know what I mean? Like, part of it was really like, I did not know what to do with the magnitude of the grief. And I don't know that I could have called it grief exactly, because I experienced it as more disorientation than anything else. I really experienced it as just like, well, I don't remember giving his eulogy, although of course I did give his eulogy. He had instructed Chris to make everybody laugh and me to make everybody cry. He had instructed me to wear a red dress to his fucking funeral, which I did. And I'm like, you son of a bitch. Anyway, so I wore a red dress to this motherfucker's funeral. He had instructed there to be no reference to God in a church, right? Like we were like, we're not sure how we were going to swing that. And there was to be no On Eagle's Wings, no playing of the song On Eagle's Wings, because he was very much an atheist. And yet, you know, and of course the organ broke immediately because Brian haunted it, we're pretty sure. And the organist was like, well, like she panicked and didn't have any sheet music for the piano. So she went over to the piano and started playing On Eagle's Wings. So all 13 honorary pallbearers are cracking up as we're processing down the aisle for this bastard's funeral. And so like at that point, we're like, see, he's just going to fuck us up for the rest of our lives. And he kind of has, you know what I mean? Like, so like she's playing On Eagle's Wings and nobody knows why we're laughing. I don't remember what I said in the funeral. The only thing I remember of the entire eulogy is I don't know what to do with all of this love. Like, and that remains my question. You know, that remains my question. Where he was in my life was so large that the love for him and the love for him was so much for him. It wasn't just a general love that goes anywhere, right? Like it's the specific to that person. And I think it is a sibling relationship. It is a person who is as much a part of your body as they are a part of your heart. I've never known what to do with all that love. I've never known. You know, I walk around with it like it's a growth, you know what I mean? Like it's my pet tumor that won't come off and it's still his, like, but he's been dead for 25 years. You know what I mean? So like, that's the sort of feeling of it, is like, there's a burdensome love left by that person. in my experience.
No, I think it's such a good way to put that. Well, it always sounds like cheesy, but I think it's one of those things that's cheesy but true, that grief really is just like love that isn't like, you can't connect to that person anymore. That, like that's just what it is. So
Yes. Yes.
I think that is kind of like the question, like, what do you do? So, okay. So I'm so fascinated by the fact. So you said, because, I think anyone that like has read your stuff knows you've like written pretty in depth and in really great ways about mental health, about, addiction, about like, so many things. Why do you think you've shied away from, whether consciously or subconsciously, writing about this big gap, this big loss?
That's a very good question. I don't know that I don't know. Like, I mean, there's lots of things. I've taken a long hiatus from books, as you know, mm-hmm. Not because I haven't had things to say, but because I've wanted to put some distance between the part of my writing life that was about mental health and recovery and addiction and traumas, right? And what I'm working on now, which has much more to do with relationships. I don't mean love relationships, but relating. Like, human relationships are much more gnarly and thorny to me, and more interesting to me now than trauma and train wreck, right? It isn't that those things aren't interesting and important. It's that I've said what I had to say about those things. Now that I'm here encountering relationships in my writing all the time and looking at what are they and how do they work and what do we do that makes them so flawed and fallible and failed in many cases. I think one of the reasons I don't know how to write about Brian is because most of the relationships in our life that end not through death, but through friction. Like, there's a crisis, there's a breakage. The relationships that end through death, we expect those to be elders, or at least we do for a part of our life. Like, and in this stage in my life, I'm starting to realize that my peers are starting to get sick, and eventually we will also become the generation at the end of the pew, as they say, will fall off, and the next generation will be at the end of the pew. But like, for much of one's life, most relationships end through breakage or conflict of some kind, or even through misunderstanding. With Brian, it felt, and because he was so young, because we are so young when we lose a sibling often as a young person, it feels unfair. Like, there's a sense of justice that is not served when you lose someone who is 25 years old. You know what I mean? And you're like, but this was my person. You know what I mean? There's a sense of, I can't do this without him here. Like, you know what I mean? Like, there's a sense of injustice. There's, of course, death is unjust no matter how you cut it. Like, it doesn't matter if it's losing a parent young or losing a parent at any time in one's life. It doesn't feel fair. We're none of us done when we lose someone. Never, never. But losing someone young just flies in the face of even, I think, the animal, probably mammalian belief that there's a cycle to life, and that's not it. You know what I mean? Like, that's not it. It's like when a parent loses a child. I don't have children, so I don't know. But my observation of friends who have had children who've died is that there is a sense, there's a degree to which the mind will not even allow for this having happened. Like, this isn't how it works. This doesn't make sense. Like, you know what I mean? Like, and so I think that's part of why I have not written about it, is because I don't have a way of making sense of it, or even of articulating it beyond this very childlike, but it's not fair. And that's not a very good narrative. It's not a good story at all.
That's true. Yeah, the editor might be like, so you just wrote, fuck this is not fair, repeatedly.
No. Exactly. So like, that's partly why is I don't have, I mean, there is a way to write about the loss of an elder. There's with beauty, I'd say, or at least with insight. Whereas I think there's part of this that denies insight because it's just fucking dumb. Like, you're like, no. And so I remember it was Donald Hall, who wrote a poem called, I believe it's called Poem for My Mother. It's basically, the beginning of the poem is, as he's watching his mother die, he thinks to himself, well, now I'll have a dead mother poem. And I'm like, See, that's a horrible fact about artists is we're all filing this shit away, right? And so, okay, well, I guess I'll do that now. And I don't have a way of articulating. And I actually think this speaks to the purpose of your project. There isn't a forum for the dead brother story. Like, there's no genre. There's no dead sibling memoir. There's not even a way of talking about it. There's the dead kid. You can write the dead mother poem. You can write the dead baby story. You can't. How do you write about the other part of you that's no longer present, but you're still talking to it as if it's right there, informing all your decisions and bickering with you in the fucking airport? You know what I mean? Like wherever you are, And so I think that's part of it, is that like, there's not a genre for it. There's not a forum for it. There's not a way of understanding it on the page. Or at least if there is, I don't know it.
Yeah. No, that's a great insight. Well, and I think of too, like, I know in the case of my brother, like he was 46 when he died, which still feels aggressively young to me.
Yeah, that's absurd. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like, especially he never met a vegetable he didn't like. It was just one of those things you're like, what? How is this happening?
Yeah.
But I feel like when that happens in the case of someone dying outside of those kind of what we would consider more normal time to die, like older years. Often they leave behind, like he left behind kids, he left behind a wife, and so I think I've been reflecting too on how when you're in the sibling role, you're I think trying not to center your grief too much because you don't want to be an asshole, but you know what I mean? Like, yes. Not that I wasn't, I mean, I it's so funny you talk about, I think I spent the entire first year, I was drinking all the time and just a mess, and God bless my family and friends. But I feel like as a rule though, like I think my sister didn't really talk about him. And my parents, I feel like, yeah, they just kind of numbed out, and then there were the kids. So there's just like all these moving pieces that I think makes it more complicated too. Yes. It's not quite that, for lack of a better word, like clean, like, yeah, like you said, when a parent dies, it's like, this is painful, this is hard, but there's a sense to it. I like how you put, there doesn't make sense. There's a sense to it. I don't know. Yeah.
It's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, barring major disaster, my parents will die before I do. Like, right. I mean, but then I worry about that. Like, there's part of me that's like, oh, I can't die. It would be very upsetting for my parents. You know what I mean? Like, I don't want to upset them with it being all out of order. You know what I mean? Like, you don't want it to be out of order, even though I don't want my parents to die. I don't even want to live through that. You know what I mean? Like, that's a grief that like, I'm like not prepared to face, but of course I will face it, one hopes, and not the other way around. You know what I mean? And so like, that's the sort of things, there's not that clean break. Grief isn't clean, no matter how you cut it, but there is an order in which it is supposed to happen. And it didn't with a sibling, with a sibling or a sibling figure in your life, it doesn't happen. And you aren't the grieving widow, and you aren't the grieving children, and you aren't the parents who've lost a child young. And so like in my family, one of the things that was very striking to me was that my family collapsed when Brian died. Like the extended family fell the fuck apart. Like I don't know where half these people are. And like, it was like he was the pin that held the whole thing, the one card that you move it and the whole thing goes down. And I don't know what that is, but something about it was so appallingly unright that nobody knew how to talk about it, particularly as a larger family either. And so I think when you're talking about your sister didn't really talk about it, your parents kind of shut up. I think there's a way in which a family structure, however large or small it may be, the family does not know how to grapple with the loss of a young member. It doesn't. It really doesn't.
Well, yeah. So that, because another thing I find myself thinking about is like how, with losses like that, it does like, because everyone grieves differently. And I think in some ways there can be like almost like if you have someone that really wants to talk about something and someone that wants to just ignore it, you can have like these like really big clashes that happen. Yeah. Did you find that kind of in your own family too? Like, kind of a very big mix of how people grieved, or did any of that clash in any way? Or,
now that you mentioned is literally the family fell apart right after that. That year, so his parents would be my aunt and uncle. That year, I got a divorce. My parents got a divorce. His parents got a divorce. My brother got a divorce. Everybody scattered, like we scattered. And so the following Christmas, like after, we're not terrifically, well, some of the family members are, but we hadn't been, but we had always spent holiday times, at least that side of the family, which is, Christmas celebrating. I wouldn't say Christian, by heritage Jewish, but anyway, like the following Christmas, I didn't know where to go. Like my brothers were both, one was in the middle of a divorce and had gone off with a new girlfriend. One was married and had children of his own. My mother was off with her sister and their family. My father had a new girlfriend and was off with her. And I literally wound up going home with a terrible boyfriend to Wisconsin and being like, you fuckers eat stuffing from a bag. Do you not know how to make stuffing? You know what I mean? Like something about it. And that Christmas, like I'm not religious, right? But I can sing. And I always had gone to church on Christmas to make my dad happy, basically, because, because I can sing and my dad likes to sing. So off we go with this, toddling off to some Lutheran Midwestern church. I got there and opened my mouth to sing and could not make a sound. I couldn't make a sound. I couldn't vocalize a note. I can really sing. And so like, there's no reason I couldn't sing, but I couldn't even, it wasn't high notes. It wasn't low notes. I could not make a sound. And so my family evaporated. So I can't tell you entirely how all of them dealt with it because I don't feel like I've seen them since in some ways. I have individual relationships with my father, my mother, both of them are still living. My brothers, the family never really was a thing again. After having been a thing for decades, generations, the family ended there.
That's interesting to think about. Well, I find myself when I hear you say, because I feel like I've heard people say similar things around big losses, and I sometimes wonder how much of that is like, the nature of like certain people are just like pins within a family, or how much of that is like we are even people that are a little more communally or community like minded. We're such an individual society that there is almost like an individualizing of grief even when it's like it's not an individual, like everyone grieves in a case like that. Everyone's grieving this person. I don't know, that's just a completely underbaked thought that has jumped in my head, but I just wonder if it looks like drastically different in like other cultures or in like families that have a like kind of different, because I feel like kind of the United States, there's kind of a shared just individualism.
Yes. So. I wonder that too. Like, I mean, I have friends who have lost siblings who are practicing Jews, not just heritage Jews, like some of us, but like so sitting Shiva can provide some of that. And the wake in Catholic, in Catholic families can provide some of that. Like the moment after the funeral, we had what we called the funeral party afterwards. I mean, there was the funeral party and I broke Brian's stories. And then there was the family Shiva wake after at the house. And then Brian had instructed me to take his credit card and take everybody out to the sports bar and max his card because he was dead. And so he was like, we're just going to stick nobody with this bill. And so we all got completely hammered at Benchwarmer Bob's in Burnsville, Minnesota. Right. And that's the last, it can't be the last we spoke of it, but it seems like it. Like we all went our own ways after that, and we were young also. So like he and I were in our early 20s. Our peers eventually, of course, went off and got married and did all of those things and had kids. And like, so they went on with their lives. And so lots of those people who were at that time kind of the party crew went off and became good, upstanding citizens. I'm not one of those people, but they did that. And like they did that and they bred and they have houses and they go on vacations and they do things like that. So I don't know who from that group of people, other than me, carries the visceral awareness of the loss of Brian in the same way, because other people, had families, they made families. I didn't. And mine, the one I was born into, the one Brian was adopted into, the one we grew up in, collapsed. And so I don't I don't know. Part of it, yes, is the individualism. Part of it is, I think, I think there is in some families, I think there is a healer role. Somebody plays the role of the healer. And Brian played that for us. And I think when he was gone, he was our good person. The rest of us were, and I think probably not as much as we made ourselves and each other out to be, fuck ups. Brian was the good person. And as phantasmal as that, of course, that is, we behaved as if it was true. We behaved as if it was true. And once Brian was gone, we were all unethical fuckwits, and there was no saving us. And you know what I mean? And so we gave up, I think, in many ways on the effort. I think in many ways we'd been staying together because Brian mattered. And after he was gone, I think there was a bit of an existential fuck it then. You know what I mean? Like, I think that really happened for people. And whatever glue had been holding us together was no longer applicable, didn't apply anymore. We didn't need to stay together, and everybody scattered. And so, like, I think that's tragic in its own strange way. But I also think Brian, were he alive right now, he'd be, what would he be? 50, exactly, turning 50. I think if he were alive right now, he would be like, why did any of us ever hang out? Why did any of us spend any time together? We don't agree on anything. All we do is fight. And so, like, I think he and I would have stayed tight. I think he would have stayed tight with his parents, but I don't know that it would have sustained itself much longer anyway. You know what I mean? So I can't really say that for sure. But I think communal grieving, I think that can become its own trauma bond sometimes in some families. I think families who've lost a child, especially to a child who has completed suicide, that trauma bond can become its own toxic tie. You know what I mean? I've seen that happen as well. So
yeah, no, that's a great insight. Well, I guess along those lines, like, because I know for me, when Coley died, and then I would bring up to people, it wasn't really until I said that it almost, like, because I'd had several friends that I was, either fairly close to, or at least had, like, had some real conversations with, and they had never mentioned losing a sibling until I said it. And it was almost like entering some horrific club. They were like, oh yeah, no, I'm a member too, right. And have you found the kind of the same, like, when you bring up Brian, or do you feel like that opens people up to tell you, or have you noticed any sort of patterns like that?
I don't bring up Brian for that very reason, and I'm sure that's why, but I think there's also, I talk about a lot of things that other people would, I think are more personal, but other people's prescription of what's personal is so shaming and bullshitty anyway. But, like, I think I care much more about my memory of Brian than I care about the train wreck shit I've gone through. Like, that, I don't have any shame around that. And there's a public health issue involved with, like, talking about mental health stuff and addiction. There's a purpose in speaking about that publicly or writing about it publicly. I think I feel somewhat protective of my relationship with Brian and my memory of it. And it's in part because I have had the experience of the pile-on that can occur when you speak publicly about a personal experience, or an experience you yourself go through. So, like, the pile-on when I give a talk on addiction is valuable because it lets people come up and say to me, this is my experience. That's, like, the best thing about speaking publicly about some experiences that are supposed to be hidden, is that other people are liberated then to come talk about their experience with it. But it is also a capitalizing on it, is that, like, if I open the door and say, this was my experience with addiction, I want people to feel free to tell me their experience with addiction and to reflect that back to me, because it does liberate them. But it is also exhausting for me. Like, the number of people's stories I carry because I talk about my own is extraordinary. And I do a lot of, like, energy work trying to kind of shed some of the grief of that. And I think I can't brace myself in the same way if I talk about what feels like to me a true grief, like losing Brian is a true grief, whereas addiction, you can end an addiction. You can fix it. Like you can leave it behind. I can't ever remedy the fact that Brian's gone. So to me, that's a true grief in some way, that like, if I go out and talk about, well, I lost my cousin and he was the only person I ever really loved, I can't carry other people's stories with that because it's already too heavy to carry the one. You know what I mean? I think that's one of the reasons that I don't write about it too. I think so. You know, do I feel like I joined kind of a club with it? I don't know that I belong, because he wasn't, strictly speaking, he wasn't my sibling exactly, but also I don't know how to talk to people about it really. You know, I don't know how to talk about, because like all losses, it feels specific to me, you know, like all of our losses. No one will understand this because it's mine. Well, we all understand each other's losses because they're all of ours, right? Because like there's this delusion of like exceptional grief and exceptional unique suffering, which is nonsense. But I still think that's informing why I don't talk about it much, you know?
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Well, I guess so kind of along that, the other thing I was thinking about is how, like, you know, how grief takes different shape and kind of changes over time. Like, how would you say your grief for him has changed over time? Like, obviously, you know, you said that first year is like a lot of like drunk and like, well, you know,
Yeah.
would you say like, were there certain markers you can remember hitting with it? Or from what you say, you don't talk about it. So is it more something you kind of put somewhere to not look at too much? You know what I mean? Like, I guess what is the,
Yeah.
how would you say it's changed?
That's such a good insight in that it changes shapes. It does change shapes. I think, you know, at first it was just that acute piercing, nothing can happen because this hurts so much. Like nothing can do, it's like having a migraine. Like you can't see, talk, move, breathe. No, you can't think. It hurts too much. You know what I mean? So like that first period of time, the grief is so acute that there's no doing anything else. And then eventually, I think what I did was set it aside a bit so I could at least proceed with the day to day. And then one of the first things I did after that was get sober. I mean, it was definitely a direct line between Brian died, my drinking and drug use escalated to a finite point. Like it was stop or die, like stop or die. And I don't say that to be dramatic, but like those were definitely the options. And so I stopped. And I think I remember people saying a lot about how Brian would have been proud of me. And I was like, shut up. Brian was such a fucking smart ass. He would never have been so saccharine as to say, I'm proud of you. Of course he did, right? Like, you know, he did say shit like that all the time. But like, I was grumpy about it. And I don't think I could have, this will sound ridiculous, speaking as a person who is largely an atheist. I'm pretty sure I couldn't have gotten sober without Brian. You know, I'm pretty sure there was no way I would have seen a reason to if I had not had a sense of his presence, whether in memory or in some other form contained, you know, in me. I don't believe that I could have or would have seen reason to get sober had I not been aware of him informing my life still. And so at first, it was as guide, you know, my memory of him was as guide. And then it became more integrated into my life. And I think now, when I look at it now, this is 25 years on, it is almost as fresh in some ways as it was then, because I had to compartmentalize it for a long time. And now I don't have to. Now it feels very raw. Now it feels very recent because I had to set it aside to get sober, to write some books, to nurse my own spouse, you know, who was very, very ill. You know, I mean, like, you know, lots of life things came up. Other losses happened, but nothing was like that. There was no loss like that. And so it feels fresh and familiar and recent. And I will tell you this, part of my brain does not fully believe he's gone. Part of my brain acts as if it didn't end and is continuing the relationship to this day. Like, I mean, it continues to believe. There's a lot of magical thinking in there, you know, about, it's not bargaining. It's not the stages of grief. It's that it never really agreed to Brian dying. And so it's like, well, I just am not going to participate in that. Like, you know what I mean? Like there's a special kind of crazy going on there where I'm like, well, he may as well still be here because I'm still talking to him. You know what I mean? Like it's a little one-sided, but I think I've internalized who he is to such an extent. And we were so close, so close. That I don't ever, there's not much in my life that I cannot imagine how he would respond or approach it. There's not much. It's much more like having a twin in some ways, in that I couldn't tell you what he would say at any given time. And I don't feel like it's the 25-year-old him. I feel like it's the 50-year-old him, like the him he'd be now. And of course, that's a construction in my head. Of course, that's, a fantasy ghost or my imaginary friend, whatever. You know what I mean? Like it's working for me. And I can't even help myself from saying there's part of me that wants to go, and it's working for him too. Like, what the hell am I talking about? But there it is. Like, that's the truth of it. Is I can like my executive function is aware that that's nonsense. And the rest of my brain's like, fuck off. It's not, you know what I mean? Like it's completely real. So, okay. Some people believe in God. Well, that's working for you, dude. Like that's super neat. Doesn't make any fucking sense logically, but okay.
No, when you talk about like, yeah, talking to that version of him now, I don't know why, but I keep thinking of that. I don't know if you know that I was obsessed with a lot of Cheryl Strayed's work for a while, like her Dear Sugar. Like, yeah, she had some really good stuff, and like she had this great line to this one dad that wrote in that lost his son, that the life that he would have had with his son was like the ghost ship that wouldn't carry him. And I don't know, that's kind of what I think of when you talk about that. It's like, yeah, it's like you can like talk to someone, but it's like this, yeah, the ghost ship that didn't carry you,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But it is no less a feature of my mental experience or being intangibly real.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? In the same way that people who have faith, that's a big feature of their experience. I don't have that feature of my experience. I have Brian.
No, I love it. Well, I guess so, kind of related to that. So, because the question I was going to ask you kind of touched on it, but like, I think of how for me, there are weird times. I had this like the other night, because since my dad died a few months ago, there were moments of acute sadness over that. And I had this like, I just hadn't had it in years, this feeling of I wanted to call Coley. Like it was like in my, like to go, like it physical, like I will call him. And some part of my brain was convinced like, oh, he'll answer, it was, and I hadn't had that in years. So there's moments like that where, yeah, it's like he feels, for lack of a better term, he feels closer. And then there's other times and these are almost like harder in some ways, he feels like more of a memory. Does that make sense? Like, do you have those kinds of experiences too, where it's like, the closeness of him is different depending, or how would you, or is it totally different? Or
I think partly because it has been longer, and this will sound very odd because he died in 1998, which was before really cell phones. So I don't ever pick up my phone, this physical phone, and think I'll call Brian, because when I was calling Brian, he was attached to the fucking wall. Call Brian, you had to pick up the phone. And also I have a lot of memory bound up in the physicality of calling, because he had muscular dystrophy. To get a hold of me during an emergency, he'd have to knock the phone off the hook and press the speed dial to get me, right? Like, because he couldn't, pick up a phone because his muscles didn't work. So like, I think I'm aware of an embodied Brian that is very much a memory, but that's also as much a memory of the pre-millennium world where phones were attached to the wall, and I had to go through his stuff and like make sure his like coupons for the strip club, his mom didn't find them, you know what I mean? Like, like all the shit that whoa, we got to get his coin purse out here, man. Like, just stuff those in there right now and somebody stick it in their pocket. So like, that was a world in which the materiality of the world was so different at that time. And so there's a memory of the material Brian that isn't recent, that isn't close. But the idea of the Brian and his informing everything I fucking do is very close, but that doesn't, there's not, what it feels like is like mentally roughly about here there is the year 2000, telephones, death, and on the other side of it, there's Brian. Like, right, I can't get to the material Brian because that's back there. Like the 2000s sealed that world off and sealed me off from the material Brian in a very, very concrete way. I listened to that voicemail from him, that last voicemail from him, over and over and over and over. But now we don't have phones with answering machines that you press a button, right? So like even the technology to access the Brian is gone, is obsolete. Like that world, that material world is obsolete. That strip club is still there, but it is now in the middle of a hip and hopping sort of North Loop, sort of everything costs $1 bazillion. I'm like, how did he fucking even get down there in his cheerleading, whatever. So like, it's a different physical world. I think there's a way in which that's a saving grace, because I don't confuse the memory of the material Brian with the present tense idea of Brian, which doesn't feel time bound and it doesn't feel materially bound either. Like there's no confusion. I can't call him, which I'm pissed about, but I'm not confused. You know what I mean? Yeah.
No, that's a great way to put that. Okay. Yeah. And then so I guess like, so part of why I'm doing this project is to, give people some sort of like resource or, just some, I guess, kind of like sense of community of people that have, lost someone. And so like, is there anything that comes to mind that, I don't know, not like words of inspiration, but like information and anything that like you wish you had, especially in those like initial years after losing him, like any sort of insights, anything that you kind of wish someone had shared, like, whatever it is around losing him?
Yes, I think if I had known I'd get to keep him in some weird, fantastical way, it would have been comforting to me. I think I would have found comfort in, though those the first year, a few years are painful, I think the long range changing form of grief is a saving grace. I think that has allowed me to keep that relationship alive in a way that I don't know that everyone in my family or everyone who lost him has. And I think because I had enough magical thinking going on without being aware of it, I think if one could more deliberately say, what are the ways I want to keep this person, one could find comfort in that. One could write one's way into comfort. One could think about the imagined sibling and what would you carry forward with you? Because I think de facto, my brain has done that for me and it is comforting. But I think the ability to know you get to keep your sibling, if not here, then somewhere, and not in a religious way, not in a ghosty way, but like the idea of them. If you want to get into super like wonky quantum mechanics, like there's no reason you aren't in fact creating them as an idea in your mind. And there's a reality to that, but spooky action at a distance if you're Einstein. So like, that's the sort of thing about it, is that like finding comfort in something other than my Dutch gin probably would have served me well. You know what I mean? I think the grief came in such waves for me that I could have more than anything used comfort, not words of wisdom, but really more than anything, words of comfort. Because it's not that I felt, I think some siblings feel like their family forgets they're grieving. I didn't feel like my family forgot I was grieving. I felt like everybody just went into their little hidey hole and never came out. And I didn't know that would happen. But I also didn't know that the one person I'd get to keep was Brian. I think that would have been coming that time.
Yeah. No, so that's would you say those are the words that, like when you say you were seeking comfort at that time? Because I think similarly, I was like seeking comfort after Coley died. Like, would you say those are the words of comfort you would give someone, is like that? You get to keep them.
I think that's the comforting thing that I would say, is that whether you create an outward art object or a manifestation of them, as you and I both write and create works for performance, and that stuff has a life. If that's a way of keeping someone, that's fine. I think what I would say though is that you get to keep that person, and the loss is not absolute in the way that I thought it was. And that's what I would say. It's not words of wisdom. It's not, I wish I had known that the loss was not absolute, because the abject terror and existential despair into which I fell in those first few years probably was deeper than it needed to be. I think if someone had said, this is not an absolute end, this is not gone in the way that you imagine gone to be gone. You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense to me. Well, I think of too, I don't know if you've had this experience too, but how I, because it's been about 7 years, or it'll be 7 years in May since Coley died, and how I think of how I've gravitated towards people that have like, kind of some of his spark. Like I think of a lot of the friends I've made, or, people I've gravitated have like some quality of his that I find, I was like, that's like a Coley quality, like, do you think that's kind of influenced like how you've connected to certain people? Or?
For sure. I have wound up with a lot of Charlie Brown Christmas tree people in my life. And Brian was, you know what I mean? Like he would have, I think, very much approved of that description of him. Brian was brilliant and his body didn't work. And so like he's the guy who'd be like, he'd be meeting someone for coffee and he'd say, you can't miss me. I'm the only Korean guy in a wheelchair, like in the place. Right. And so like, I have a lot of, I think this as much as by virtue of the fact that my whole family is very, very diverse, multiculturally, very people from all over the world. Right. I think that gives me, I think for a white person, I'm more comfortable with people of color because people of color are my family. That doesn't make me not a racist. It just makes me less awkward in multicultural situations sometimes. But I also think like in terms of the people to whom I am drawn, it is never visual. I'm never drawn to people's body, their material self, right? Like what I'm there for is their mind. Like what's there? Like, what are you making? What are you doing in this world? Because and spoke long and articulately about being in a body that would not do what he needed it to do, but his mind did. Like his mind was sharp as a fucking tack. And so I've never been particularly swayed by or drawn to people of physical beauty more than not. You know what I mean? Like, I don't really care what body you're in. And I don't mean to sound like, Samantha Irby writes brilliantly about being in a meat suit. Like, but I mean that like, bodies are great. Like I have nothing against them, but like, that's not what draws me to people. And I think the influence Brian has had on me, I'm not uncomfortable around people in wheelchairs, which a lot of able-bodied people are. Yeah. I'm not uncomfortable around any form of physical disability because I'm quite familiar with it. You know what I mean? Bodies are just super lumpy and difficult, and they fail constantly. They're breaking. Like they're just so fucking designed. They're a design disaster, and the world beats them up, right? Like so, like there's nothing consistently working on anybody's body, and so that I think. The brokenness of the body doesn't seem tragic to me. It doesn't seem tragic. It doesn't seem troubling in some ways. Like, people are like, oh, I'm getting old. I'm like, shut up. You know what I mean? Just literally shut up. Are you alive? Did you get up this? But are you dead? Did you die? But you know what I mean? Like, because Brian did. Like, sorry, but like,
are you dead?
Because if not, then we're good. You know what I mean? Like, and so it's not that it probably could seem callous to some people, but what it is a lack of real concern about the various and sundry disabilities we're all kind of walking around with. Like mine aren't visible, they aren't physical, but I got plenty of broken bits, going on here. And like, so that just means those are my broken bits, and Brian's happened to be his body. Brian's broken bits were his body. And so what I mean by like Charlie Brown Christmas trees of people, that's everybody, right? In a lot of ways. Like we're all a little bit scraggly and tilted in some really dramatic fashion. Most of us just are hiding it a lot of the time. And a Korean guy in a wheelchair has less ability to hide it. So when he comes zipping up, like this was my favorite thing about Brian ever. he was on the debate team when he was in graduate school, and he was in graduate school, and the Oxford debate team came to debate his university, his debate team. And he was the captain, and he had invited Oxford, and they came at his, they were a very good debate team. So Brian, in a tuxedo and his wheelchair, zips up to the mic and has to wait for somebody to pull it down, right? Like, so it's in front of him. And he waits till everybody's totally silent and awkward. And he says to the entire assembled audience, I know what you're thinking. And everybody goes, and he goes, you're thinking, there's the son of a bitch who got the last good parking spot. Everybody fucking lost it. Like, nobody could proceed for the rest of the night. And Oxford didn't have a chance. Like, they didn't have a fucking chance. Because Brian's like, good joke. And he proceeds. Like, he goes on with him. Like, but like, it's not, you know, yes, I think it's an easy way of saying, like, we laugh at what, you know, at what we, otherwise it'll kill us. But also sometimes this shit's funny, like funny. And you have to just have a slightly grimmer and more macabre sense of humor to really appreciate some of that, like the red dress to his funeral. But like, also, I find people's disasters very unthreatening. You know, I find people's crises unthreatening. You know, when people are in really, really dire straits, I'm like, well, I guess here we are in dire straits. I guess this is what we're doing today. You know what I mean? I think what he gave me was the capacity to sit with someone when I think other people have long since gone home. I think he gave me that. You know what I mean? And some people would say that's a failing on my part. And I'm like, well, nobody deserves to die alone, right? So there's a lot of people that I can sit with for a lot longer than some people maybe can, you know?
Yeah. No, I think that's a really good insight, especially when you like watch someone, you know, I think there's kind of that difference. I'll be interested to, as I talk to people that have the more like sudden death, you know, like how there is something when you get kind of it's a painful privilege to be with someone as they go. You know,
I forgot to tell you, we had the Last Supper. We set it up like, so we had Brian's Last Supper, and we set up like with the whole 13, you know, and Judas and everything like that. But like, that was sort of like the thing is we had time to plan his fucking ridiculous funeral and the Last Supper, and to have all the jokes, and to like stick Citibank with a massive benchwarmer Bob's bar bill. You know what I mean? Like, we had time for him to plot and scheme and to say goodbye. And yet the goodbye, when it comes, I wouldn't trade it, because I was awake for it and I was sober for it. You know what I mean? Which shocks me now that I think about it. Why was I sober that night? I can't imagine why I was sober that night, but I was, because the phone rang and it was him, and I could hear that he had knocked the phone off and was yelling, I love you, I love you, I love you. And I was like, I love you, I love you, I love you, until the ambulance got to him. Then I got to the hospital, and then we killed him. And so like, that's the thing of it is a sudden death leaves you holding not only the love, but all the things you didn't say. You know what I mean? Brian, the last thing Brian heard in his conscious life was me screaming, I love you. That's the last thing he went out with. And I'm glad of that. You know, I feel like everybody should have someone screaming, I love you, as they go out. And that Brian got that. You know what I mean? That feels like, if nothing else good happens in my life, that's cool. Like, I'm glad of that. Because that was really, I wanted to make sure he died knowing that. And I got to say that, you know what I mean? Like, not everybody who dies, we don't all get to say that on their way out. And that's devastating to me. Like, that we can't all say that, and we don't have time. I had time to say that to Brian, and he had time to hear me just in time, you know? The sudden deaths are terrifying to me, because I'm all verbal, right? Like, what happens if I don't get to say these things to my friend? Like, here I am with things to say. And so, like, what if my mommy doesn't know that I love her, I love her, I love her, I love her? Like, what if I'm not screaming, I love you, as my mom and dad go out, which I probably won't be. Hopefully at least one, you know what I mean? But like, odds, not great. They're old. And so like, Brian was young. We had a heads up. We knew he was going to die. We knew he was going to die from the time. I don't remember a time in my life when I didn't know that. Mm-hmm. You know, so muscular dystrophy kills you young. And so I knew all my life, all my conscious life, that he would one day die, and it would be sooner than everybody else would die. So, I also don't remember having gone, well, is it soon now? I don't remember looking up at 14 and being like, hey, we're getting close. Like that's not how it went. We just had him till we didn't. And so like, that's great grace. That is some dumb fucking luck and some big grace. So.
Oh, yeah. I love the idea too. Like someone should have someone screaming, "I love you" at them.
I love you. Yeah. I mean, right when you get there. So but like, that's the thing, is it like, I don't know. I wish I could send everybody out like that, but at least one person got to go that way. So.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Okay. Yeah. Trying to think what else. I guess, are there any other, I guess, is there anything else you would want to share about him, or about the grieving process, like just kind of in a general sense?
I think the thing I would say, I mean, there's a million things to say about him, but I think the thing I would say about the grieving process is that if there is one and it is organized in any fashion, I'm unaware of it. Like, I'm sure there are stages of grief and stuff like that. I've not gone about this grieving in an organized, or I don't think I've done it right at all. You know what I mean? I've definitely grieved wrong, in that I don't know that I've grieved at all, or have not, or ever stopped grieving, or that like there was a point at which, but of course he's not a child or a spouse, right? Like he's not a partner or my own child. And so I think that is the thing about sibling grief, is that the grief is different in that there isn't a natural arc where it gets easier. I think that thing that you were saying about it's closer or it's further away at different times, and it seems to operate on its own terms in a way that spouse or child or even parental grief does not. I think that can take a more natural arc, but sibling grief really feels amorphous and disorganized to me.
That's a great insight.
And so like, I think the thing I would say about that is like, fine, don't expect it to happen in an order. Like, it's going to be what it is,
Yeah.
So.
Kind of calibrate the expectations that way. No,
yeah.
I think that's very good.